Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining. Very happy to have you here. Time is running, I was just informed. So we get started and perhaps others will join us a little later. So welcome to the panel on Profit over Planet. And we'll be looking into how to harness data to expose and halt big polluters' influence in climate action. My name is Susanne Kühn. I'm the Executive Director of Transparency International Germany, and I have a very distinguished panel with me, which I will introduce in a minute. So this panel is jointly organized by Transparency International and Influence Map. So thank you for that, first of all. And we'll be diving into climate change actions and how open data can help to expose big polluters' undue influence. So what we've seen in the recent years is that much progress has been made in terms of climate change in recent years, especially in the European Union. But at the same time, we're not on track for reaching the world's stated goals for action to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. So this realization has really alarmed climate scientists around the world. The window for action is closing fast, and civil society this is why civil society is raising questions about the role of corporate lobbyists are playing in terms of halting policy processes around climate action. And that's what we are here to discuss today. How can we use open data to expose undue influence by big polluters, and how can we use open data to advocate for how to use that looking forward. If we look at, there's some very alarming data, very alarming evidence. So if we look at the analysis done by Kick Big Polluters Out, we see that 2,400 fossil fuel lobbyists have been granted access at the recent COP28 in Dubai in December 2023. And at the same time, we only had 1,500 delegates from the 10 most vulnerable countries with regard to climate change. So we can see 2,400 lobbyists from big polluters versus 1,500 delegates from the most vulnerable nations. So we see there is a lot of lobbying going on. There's undue influence. And what we want to discuss is really to inspire using data-driven solutions to expose this influence and take it forward for policy advocacy. So welcome to my distinguished panel of speakers, which I will introduce to you very briefly. First of all, welcome to Patricia Lerner, who's the Special Advisor to the International Executive Director at Greenpeace International. Very happy to have you here. And Patricia has worked on climate negotiations for many years, with a particular focus on climate finance, sustainable energy for all, Rio +20, post-2015 development agenda and the SDGs, and climate change and security. So wonderful to have you on board. Then we have Edward Collins, Director of Lobby Map, Influence Map, who's led Influence Map's research and lobbying corporate influence since 2017. And he manages Influence Map's system for tracking and assessing the climate change lobbying of the world's largest 400 industrial companies and key trade associations. Very happy to have you on board. Thanks for being here. Then we have Rafael Cargueno. He's Senior Policy Officer for Data-Driven Advocacy with TI-EU. And he manages Integrity Watch EU's data visualization platform that's become a key resource for EU lobbying, prevention of conflicts of interest in Brussels. So I think there's a lot that we can learn from TI Brussels' work in this area. So welcome, Raphael. Happy to have you on board. Then we have Emily Clow, who's Head of Data Investigations at Global Witness. And very interestingly, Emily has overseen data investigations of the fossil fuel affiliations of COP delegates, mining for rare earth minerals in Myanmar, and laundering of Russian fossil fuels. Thanks for being here. And we have Guillaume France, expert for political integrity with TI Brazil. He's a lawyer, researcher, and he manages the Anti-Corruption Knowledge Center. And will also bring a lot to the discussion. So thank you to the wonderful panel. And I give you a very short overview on our session. So we start with a problem analysis looking into undue influence in climate action, including very practical examples and evidence from data. Then we dive into challenges and opportunities for data-driven solutions. We'll look into actions. What role can data-driven advocacy play to expose undue influence for corporate lobbyists? And we look also into a Q&A session with you as the audience. So that's designed more as a conversation, as a discussion, because all of you can bring a lot to the table. So please do share all of your experience, good practices, and lessons learned from your own work. And then we have some concluding remarks from the panelists. So let us dive directly into the session, starting with Patricia Lerner. And I would really be keen to learn from your experience with Greenpeace, what concrete examples have you found of corporate undue influence at the global level and the impact on climate actions?
Thank you, Suzanne. Is this working? Thank you. So thank you, Suzanne. I thought before diving into a specific example, it would be helpful for the audience to maybe have a framing so that we could contextualize what we're talking about. So, Flora, could I trouble you for the first slide? Sorry, is this something people can see? No, we can see it. The first slide. Are we? So, I thought it would be helpful to think of the examples we're all going to be speaking to if we talked about it in the context of mechanisms or signals that come from the lobbying process, and then separately the outcomes of the lobbying, so you can understand the different entry points and what comes out. So I'm not going to go into all the details of the slide. I believe this has, it's behind me now. But on the left-hand side, you'll see that these mechanisms or signals come out in a number of areas. You'll see revolving doors between selected industries and governments, and we have done a number of analyses documenting this, particularly in Spain, Germany, and elsewhere. The Greenpeace European level did a report, Smoke and Mirrors, which focused on the fossil fuel industry, the polluters who became their own regulators, which is a summary of basically what is happening and what's not correct about all of this. You have direct and indirect state ownership in major international oil companies like ENI, Equinor, Total Energies. You have how state representatives in key oil companies vote for climate shareholder admissions at AGMs, et cetera. So you have a number of these examples that look at jobs, elections, politics. And then what comes out the other end are these impacts of the influence, with some examples being on the fiscal side, where you have subsidies, tax breaks, you have public financing for fossil fuels, where there was a recent analysis done by SOMO of the Netherlands, which found a new study found fossil fuel subsidies at the order of 37 billion per year, and public financing for fossil fuel and other destructive sectors. The G7, which met last weekend, which committed to phasing out fossil fuel subsidies by 2025, is still producing 257 billion in fossil fuel and other destructive sectors, according to Price of Oil's recent study. Then you have the financing of multilateral banks, financing and insurance, lack of carbon pricing or very low carbon prices in a number of key economies, including Brazil, which I hope Guillermo will talk about. And then the general rights of corporations. What's a corporation? A corporation is a legal entity that's separate and distinct from its owners. Under the law, corporations possess many of the same rights and responsibilities as individuals. And so you end up with favorable accounting rules for selective corporations, accruals, et cetera. So that's kind of a framing for what we're all going to be discussing and giving specific examples from our data. I was asked to provide a particular case study, and most of our conversation will be in the context of the UN Framework Convention for Climate Change, otherwise referred to as UNFCCC for those who are not familiar, and we usually refer to the COP, Conference of the Parties. I'm going to give an example from the plastics negotiations. Thank you, Flora. Because plastics are the plan B for the fossil fuel industry. As many of you will be aware, they are resisting the fair, fast phase out of fossil fuels that we are lobbying for in the context of the UNFCCC. And so they are very much inhabiting the space of the plastic negotiations, where plastics are set to drive nearly half of the oil demand growth by mid-century, according to the International Energy Agency. And so you see the fossil fuel and petrochemical lobbyists out in force in the plastics treaty space, including sitting on country delegations like Malaysia, Thailand, Iran, and Uganda. And we've seen how the positions of those countries has changed from one negotiating round to the next, with most recently Malaysia coming in with a much weaker position. We have the states with vested interests in petrochemical expansion fighting very hard in the plastics treaty space to even remove any reference to the word polymer from the text and stopping any measures that would curb the production of plastics. Let's be clear, from a scientific standpoint, plastics harm human health, biodiversity, and the climate across the entire life cycle. Increased production and consumption of plastic means more harm for frontline communities, and there have been cases documented in Canada with First Nations that have experienced being exposed to discharge from benzene production who have brought their cases forward. There's also increased risk of flooding in developing countries, which Tier Fund has documented, where you have waterways that are clogged with plastic, which can also increase the risk of disease like malaria and others, and numerous examples of plastic waste being illegally exported to the global south from the global north. The Basel Action Network has documented some of those examples. And lastly, scientists who have been providing critical data to inform the negotiations have reported instances of harassment and intimidation from industry lobbyists. So not a very pretty picture. So let me wrap up very quickly by referring to one specific case study which we undertook at Greenpeace Unearthed, which the New York Times reported on. It goes back a couple of years, but it's illustrative. And that is the case study of plastic lobbying in the US-Kenya trade deal, where the American Chemistry Council, which consists of Shell, Exxon, DuPont, lobbied the Trump administration to use the US-Kenya trade deal to expand the plastics and chemical industry access across Africa. And there's documented letters from the Trump administration showing the ACC pushing for Kenya to, quote, serve in the future as a hub for supplying US-made chemicals and plastics to other markets in Africa through the trade agreement, calling for the deal to prohibit imposition of domestic limits on production or consumption of chemicals and plastics, And further, so basically this is to open up further efforts to export plastic waste, which could be shipped on to other countries in Africa. So Kenyan activists and members of parliament feared this would also affect their recently passed ban on plastic bags in Kenya. So there were a lot of repercussions on this, and this has been one of the case studies that has been documented. So I think in view of the time, I will leave it there, but this is just to illustrate the depth, the breadth and reach of the fossil fuel industry.
Thank you, Patricia. I think that's a very useful framework to get an initial understanding on the influence mechanisms, but then also the influence on climate actions moving forward in our discussion. And I think this practical example is very interesting to illustrate the impact that these influencing lobbying has on climate actions. Perhaps I'll move to Edward next from Influence Map. And you've worked a lot on using data, open data, to develop recommendations and actions. Could you tell us a little more how you went about?
Yes, yeah, sure. Very happy to. Thank you. So those who haven't heard of us, Influence Map is a non-profit. We're a philanthropically funded research group. And since about 2015, we've been trying to measure how the corporate sector is impacting climate change. But very specifically, we are looking at, we're tracking and assessing how some of the largest companies in the world are trying to influence climate policy and regulation. So to help us explain what we track, we came up with this term, the carbon policy footprint for a company. Some people call this sort of scope 4 emissions. But our hypothesis is really that the impact that a company can have through trying to directly obstruct climate policy could likely be very much larger than their impact on climate through their direct emissions or even the emissions of the products they sell. Because if they successfully undermine regulation, that undercuts potential emission reductions across an entire sector or an entire economy. So there are many challenges to trying to measure the carbon policy footprint of a company, not least good disclosure on how specific policies are made and the different inputs into those policies is quite hard to come by. But while we often lack sort of smoking gun evidence of linking a company to a particular policy change, what we've tried to do is build a methodology that can develop a very strong circumstantial analysis of how companies are trying to influence different climate policies around the world. So as a bit of background, we use a very broad definition of corporate policy engagement or policy influence. This follows a UN protocol, but also kind of aligns with other definitions and work, for example, by the OECD. And what is important here is we're talking about a set of activities that goes beyond just sort of the traditional one-to-one direct engagement with politicians or policymakers, the kind of activities generally associated with the term lobbying. The expanded definition covers a range of tactics that companies actively use to influence climate policy and the broader climate policy agenda. So this includes strategic messaging, the use of advertising and media, as well as the use of intermediaries, third-party groups like industry associations and consultations, in conjunction with efforts to directly engage policymakers and politicians on a climate policy agenda. So to assess this, we use open source data harvesting techniques. We try and collect hundreds of data points on each company. And these data points are gathered from a range of different sources, like the company's own disclosures, their social media channels, their advertising streams. We also look at government disclosure channels, like where consultations are between companies and governments are disclosed. We use a lot of FOIs, freedom of information requests, when we can, to uncover what companies are saying in their meetings with policymakers. And we also spend a lot of time scanning and looking at how companies are talking about climate policy in the media as well. So there are lots of different sorts of information you can try and gather on lobbying. For example, the who, like who's involved, or how they're trying to exert, companies are trying to exert influence. What we're really interested in is the what. So like what companies are saying to policymakers, what their positions are, what their asks are, and how this relates or compares to the UN's climate agenda and internationally agreed climate targets. So we analyze hundreds of data points per company, and we assess each of these data points independently against benchmarks that we derive from the science of the IPCC, which is the UN science body, as well as international climate targets. And this provides us with two key metrics on the companies. So one showing how supportive or oppositional each company is to the climate agenda, and secondly, how involved they are in engaging with climate policy, whether they are very actively engaged in exerting their influence or not engaged so much. So next slide, please. Here are the results of the lobby map analysis. So in this platform, we actually cover, well, it's actually over 500 companies now. They're represented on this graph. They're the gray dots. And I've just popped a few logos over the top to highlight where different companies are for illustration. So along the horizontal, you have our assessment of how supportive or oppositional companies are, with very supportive on the right, very oppositional on the left. And on the vertical axis is how engaged the companies are. So very engaged companies at the top, not so engaged companies at the bottom. So to summarize a few key trends, you can see that only a very small percentage of companies are currently properly aligning their detailed policy advocacy and lobbying activities with pathways capable of delivering the Paris Agreement's goals. And those are the ones on the right side, at the very right-hand side. While others are moving in the right direction, there is a very long tail of companies that remain actively engaged against climate policy, so trying to block or delay or weaken government proposals across a range of different climate policy issues. The other notable thing about the graph is a big clustering of companies, those grey dots down the bottom, which shows a large part of the global economy in terms of the companies is not very engaged. This is despite them having climate targets, like net zero targets, that will require government policy to deliver. So they make nice-sounding climate targets, but aren't very engaged in the policy discussions. And to be honest, this is also a bit of a gap because it leaves open these policy discussions to the companies that stand to lose the most from climate policy, and this is why we often see the fossil fuel companies and the fossil fuel value chain companies that are the ones that are most engaged with climate policy discussions around the world. So I'll wrap up my initial answer. I guess our mentality at Influence Map is if you can't really address a problem unless you can measure it, and this is what we've been seeking to do. We work with lots of stakeholders, from campaign groups and civil society, the media, investors, even some parts of the corporate sector that are more positive on climate, to try and readdress the imbalance of negative influence on climate policy that we see. And maybe I can go into some examples of that in a bit. There is some progress here. Companies are warming up and becoming more positive, but it's very slow. It needs to be a lot quicker. And I think there are lots of ideas, I think, where we can use the data that we're collecting to speed this up and accelerate things.
Thank you. That's fascinating to see how you pull all these different data sources together to come up with such an influence map. And looking forward to hear more. But before I turn to Rafael Cagueno, your work has focused on the EU level. And I would be keen to hear from you what has been the TI approach towards data-driven advocacy, especially at the EU level.
Yes, thank you, and welcome everyone, and thank you very much for joining this panel today. And I must really say, like Edward, the work that you're doing is really impressive, and I hope one day we'll be able to cooperate on that. But as you said, I represent TIEU. We represent the movement towards the EU institutions, and obviously Brussels is really a key player when it comes to fighting climate change. As you know, we have a flagship policy, the European Green Deal, and the success of the European Green Deal is really key also for making sure that the objectives of the Paris Agreement stay in place. Unfortunately, and as you know, certain political winds are changing a little bit. We've seen the recent election results in Europe, where a lot of politicians sort of decried the Green Deal. And we also know that there's a lot of influence happening to try to detract or even backtrack on some of the objectives of the Green Deal. And just to situate ourselves a little bit, I want to give you a couple of numbers. So we have in Brussels 12,000 organizations that are active and trying to influence the EU institutions. We also have now a set of meetings that allows us to understand how much access these organizations have to the European Commission, the European Parliament. And for the full von der Leyen mandate, we have 12,000 meetings. For the full von der Leyen mandate in the Parliament, we have 85,000 meetings. So the scale of lobbying in Brussels is quite enormous. And if we look also at the funding and the money that is being spent on influencing activities, we have about between 1.8 billion and 2.4 billion euros. So there's really a lot of money that is also being spent on these activities. And we know this because in Brussels we have quite a robust transparency framework for lobbying. And this is something that TIU has been sort of quite relentless in improving. From humble beginnings in 2014 when the Commission decided to publish lobby meetings, but also to make the register, the transparency register, mandatory, to now having publication of meetings in the European Parliament and also mandatory elements for other EU institutions. And the way we did it is through data-driven advocacy. At the heart of this sits a platform, which is Integrity Watch EU, which simply harmonizes all this data that we have on lobbying in Brussels and provide it in an easier, user-friendly manner for everyone to engage with it. In a certain sense, it's a kind of window, allows multiple actors to have a peek into the lobbying activities in Brussels. Now, what is data-driven advocacy for us? And you have to see it a bit as a virtuous cycle, where we have an initial release of data that is uploaded to the platform. This allows us to raise awareness on our key position and everybody to just engage with the data. The second point, of course, is that we do some light touch data analysis that allows us to formulate sort of empirical evidence for our recommendations. And this is then pushed on to EU decision makers, and the empirical evidence makes our recommendations significantly stronger. And finally, what we've noticed over the years is that once you have an initial release of data and the recommendations are taken on board, you have a new release of data that is then uploaded again on Integrity Watch. And that means that the platform today really doesn't look like what it was initially. It's significantly more advanced. And the success that we had there resulted also in hundreds of media stories, academic articles, and now a number of civil society organizations that are engaging in data-driven advocacy themselves through the data that we produce. And as you can see on the map here, I just wanted to show you a bit how successful it is, because we've managed to develop these platforms in 15 EU member states. And now there are a number of platforms also being developed for Integrity Watch Balkans. But how does data-driven advocacy work when it comes to the Green Deal? We now have a project where we're looking specifically at the patterns of lobbying of what happened in the Green Deal legislation, given that we now have a full mandate of data available. And so it looks quite data heavy here, but these figures essentially tell a story. The first thing that we see is that the Green Deal was by far the most lobbied policy area in the last 5 years. It represents a volume of 12% of all meetings that the Commission published, bearing in mind that for the European Commission we only have the high-level meetings, which is the meetings with the Commissioner, Cabinet members and Director Generals. So there's still a lot that we're missing there. For the European Parliament, it represents 17% of all meetings that were published. So it really is sort of the biggest focus, largest focus of lobby organizations in Brussels. When we actually do a little bit more of a deep dive, we can see also a bit what is the balance between different types of organizations. So we have, on one hand, 64% of all those meetings representing corporate interest versus I don't see the numbers here, versus 27% for civil society organizations. So just from the data here itself, we can already see that there is an unequal balance. And we know this at heart, of course, as civil society organization, but for us to use the data and to say, you have an unequal access problem and you need to find a solution. And we successfully did it because if we looked at the previous mandate on the Juncker, this balance here on environmental policy was 90% corporate and 10% civil society organizations. So clearly there was a bit of a movement inside the Commission to at least give us a bit more space thanks to the data that we then published. But this doesn't tell the full story, because if you look simply at the top organizations on the Green Deal policy, you'd see that in the top 10, most are NGOs. So you would really think that NGOs really had a significant impact on the Green Deal, and they did, but only to a certain extent. Just one red flag that I want to mention here is that we have at least Shell and a large business association on oil for oil-producing companies that is in the top 10 itself, and that's quite striking. But what the data allows us to do is to dig a little bit deeper, because the Transparency Register asks every organization to also mention which they're connected organizations. So all the business association, think tanks to which they belong to. And we did this analysis where we basically saw how many contact points, how do you increase your contact points into the decision-making process through these connected organizations? And how does that look like for civil society? And if you look at the graph, basically for civil society, our connected organizations gives us very little extra contact points, access points into the decision-making process. For companies, if you look at the European Commission, it's plus 140%. So simply through the business associations to which they belong to, they have 140% extra access compared to civil society organizations. For the European Parliament, it gets even more striking, because the increase is 250%. So this is something that basically allows us to understand that a lot of corporations are extremely networked, and they use their resources to maximize the contact point into decisions. Now, obviously, having access doesn't necessarily mean that it translates into actual tangible changes in the legislation. But nevertheless, one problem that we've noticed is that essentially the integrity framework inside the EU institutions is unfortunately very weak. So we did another analysis, which was looking in the European Parliament on the side of the members of the European Parliament in which kind of side activities they were engaging, because it is legal. So organizations are allowed to hire members of the European Parliament, or members of the European Parliament can work for companies. Now, theoretically, they shouldn't be engaged in lobbying, but this is something that is not really followed through. And when looking on the Green Deal files, we found that 29 out of 34 had a potential conflict of interest. That is, that they were engaged in an activity that could potentially be connected to some of these corporations, or could put the members of European Parliament in a situation of conflict of interest. And this is really the core of the problem, because what we see is that we have very well networked organizations that are very well resourced and that are now facing a weak integrity framework inside the EU institutions. And the title of the planet is to put profit over planet. The title of the panel, sorry. And as Edward and Patricia really very nicely told us, there are a lot of companies that are really dead set on putting profit over planet. But on the other side, we also have politicians that want to put political profit over planet. And these are the politicians that are often most engaged in these side activities and most against the reforms that we need to shore up our integrity system. And so what we're going to do now, and we're going to continue with this data-driven advocacy work, is that we do understand the core of the problem, but now we're going to basically try to engage as much as possible with the community in Brussels that is working on environment and get them on board with this data-driven advocacy work to expose not only the influence that perhaps the fossil fuel industry has, but also to basically convince the EU decision makers that they need a robust integrity framework to ensure that undue influence does not happen, because that's basically the key way for the Green Deal to succeed. And that's it.
Raphael, I think that's a very interesting approach for strengthening transparency to then enhance accountability and look into weak areas in terms of integrity framework. And with that, I'll turn to Emily Clow, who's from Global Witness. And I would like to learn from you, how has Global Witness over the years been looking at COP especially, been able to expose patterns of corporate influence?
Thank you very much. Is this working? No. Okay. Looks like it's working, but it's not. Hello? Now it is? Oh yeah, okay, there we go. Thank you. Thank you, Suzanne. So Global Witness works on several different campaigns where we use data to highlight the role of corruption at the heart of the climate crisis. But I wanted to use the time today to highlight just a couple of projects we've worked on that do, I think, a particularly good job of using data to highlight the role of fossil fuel lobbyists and influence in the COP process. So Global Witness has been working with other NGOs as part of the Keep Big Polluters Out coalition over the last 3 years to examine the number of fossil fuel representatives attending COP as delegates. So for the last 3 COPs, we've poured over those provisional lists of COP delegates that come out sort of just at the beginning of COP, looking for delegates that had self-declared ties either to a fossil fuel company, an organization with fossil fuel interests, or any foundation directly associated by ownership or control with a fossil fuel company. So being sort of classified as any one of those organizations would be enough to qualify someone as a sort of lobbyist or influencer in our categorization. And it's important to understand this is, we think, a fairly conservative understanding of who might be a fossil fuel influencer at COP, because a lot of state delegations for states that have state-owned fossil fuel companies, state delegations will often include fossil fuel executives. So we've actually kept it a fairly, we think is a fairly conservative estimation of the number of fossil fuel executives. So as you can kind of see, these are headlines from the BBC from this work, but we found evidence of fossil fuel lobbyists at COP for several years in a row. So in 2021 at COP26 in Glasgow, we found evidence of 503 delegates who'd come from fossil fuel related organizations. In 2022 for COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, we found evidence of 636 delegates who'd come from fossil fuel affiliated companies. And then, as Suzanne referenced earlier, in 2023, we found a record 2,456 fossil fuel lobbyists who were granted access to the Dubai COP negotiations, which was, it was a big COP, but that was truly remarkable. So in order to better understand the impact of that massive rise in the number of fossil fuel related delegates at COP this last year, or just recently, we conducted an analysis of the number of oil deals that ADNOC, the state oil fossil fuel company of the UAE, the number of, or the quantity of fossil fuel deals that they'd made in 2023, and found that those numbers were massively increasing. Flora, next slide. Thank you. So in the year that the UAE hosted COP, ADNOC sought oil, gas, and petrochemical deals potentially worth close to $100 billion US, which is a 5-fold increase on what it pursued in 2022, and significantly more in dollar terms than in the previous 4 years combined. So we see a really strong connection here between the hosting of COP and this increase in the size of oil deals. I think it's really important to note that sort of similar, I don't know how many people were at the panel, the really interesting panel this morning on data and rainforests, but I thought those projects were really good at highlighting the importance of using data in the context of larger investigations and with bigger investigation techniques. And I think that our work here and a lot of our work also emphasizes that. So this is part of a bigger investigation where people sort of spoke to affiliates and people who'd sort of been in the room as well, and I think that made it really impactful. So this COP work is one of GW's biggest ongoing data projects, and then one that really kind of packs a big punch in the media. So I'm a climate person who does not hang out with climate people, but you know, my friends and husband and things have still read these headlines when they see them. So I just arrived at Global Witness in January, and when I arrived, you know, I was really excited about this work and would sort of be like, oh, hey, you know, guys, this is great work you did, like, loved it, and you'd sort of get this response of like slight horror and, you know, sort of a 1,000-yard stare and little, like there'd been some trauma there. So, you know, what I came to realize is doing this work by hand is just incredibly intense and complicated process, particularly for this last COP where, you know, so the COP, the delegates list lists are always distributed very, very late in the season. There's a very, very late in the COP process, and there's a real pressure to kind of turn these investigations around, to kind of bring this to people's attention while COP is still ongoing. And these lists are massive, so they just tend to be this huge logistical challenge. So one of the first things people asked me when I arrived was, Emily, can you find an AI solution for this? And I was like, oh, it's not a magic wand AI. It's, I don't know how much we can do here. But, I was new and I sort of wanted to say yes to everybody. So I said, I'll have one of my guys look at it, and we'll see where we can get. And so this year we've actually been, we're working on and kind of piloting an AI sort of approach to doing this that I think is really interesting and potentially kind of a nice example of how you can use AI in really helpful ways, as long as it's kind of human connected. So the person I put on this came up with just sort of a nice solution where we look at the list of organizations. He uses a sort of automated Google search to find out information about those. He feeds that into a large language model, so something like ChatGPT. It won't be exactly ChatGPT. And then it returns a result, whether it thinks that person or that organization is fossil fuel affiliated or not. But the thing is, then those individual decisions will be checked by a human, and what's my favorite detail, he calls a Tinder-like interface, where you can sort of choose yes, that you agree with the LLM, or no, or you're not really sure. So we're not 100% sure that it's going to work out. We're still working on it. We're still piloting it. But we found really positive or really useful results so far. So sometimes it does find some false positives. So people who work on fossil fuels, anti-fossil fuel lobbyists will sometimes get identified as fossil fuel lobbyists because it says fossil fuels a lot in their kind of job descriptions. But we're pretty optimistic about using this as a kind of a nice, useful tool that's kind of still sort of human checked, a good way to use AI for these kinds of projects.
Thank you, Emily. I think it's fascinating to hear about how AI can actually be deployed to go one step further. So now we've heard about global policy influence. We've heard about EU level, and I would like to turn to Guillaume France. You work for TI Brazil, and you're saying you've been able to track how corporate interests have been taking over. So over to you.
Thank you for the question and the invitation. What I think, when we got the invitation to participate in this panel, my initial impression and my initial feeling was, well, what can we contribute to this? Because at a national level in Brazil, and I think this is similar to most countries in the world, we don't have access to the level of information that is available at the EU level. So when Rafael mentions all the amount of meetings, the number of lobbyists that are registered, I'm just very envious because I don't have that information. It's not available, it's not registered in Brazil, and I think in most countries they are also not registered. So what can we do when we just don't have enough data, or I know that it's not perfect, but a good set amount of data that you think can produce more detailed information? That's what I think I could bring to the table, because I think that's relatable to most countries where you don't have necessarily good lobbying regulation, you don't have necessarily good conflict of interest legislation, freedom of access to information legislation. And on a personal and institutional level, I think it's also useful to note that even individuals such as myself, who I'm not really a data person, or I'm a little bit afraid of an Excel table, so it's difficult to produce more data focused material. I'm more of a qualitative researcher. And institutionally, not all organizations have the capacity to invest in these types of super interesting tools, AI and others, to produce this type of information. What can we do? So sort of data for dummies, and I'm the dummy in this case. So what we tried to do was look into 3 particular institutions in Brazil, which are the main institutions in the process of decision making, and try to look into their role in terms of energy policy, which of course is a major aspect of climate action. So looking into the House of Representatives, I think as in most countries, we do have a committee who works exclusively on energy policy. So what we tried to do there was look into the public hearings, which are supposed to be the place where civil society is present, where different interests can present their arguments and their facts, and to see whether civil society was actually present, whether these different arguments were being made, and the facts regarding the impact of energy into climate action was being heard. At the Federal Senate, we tried to, because we don't have a lobbying register, so it's not possible to get information on how many lobbyists actually get into the Senate. What we do have is a format of particular individuals who are able to get credentials to have easier access to the building. So we did a freedom of information request to get access to who does actually have access to the building in this facilitated manner. And we also look into the executive branch, into the schedule of the energy minister to see how those interests are represented and what is the size and scope of the business interests in this particular space, which is the highest level of discussion regarding energy policy at the federal level. So, Flora, next slide. Thank you. So this is what we saw in terms of civil society within the Energy Committee at the House of Representatives. Only 18% of participants in public hearings represent civil society, which is significantly less than corporate business interests represented in those instances. And it should be said that in many of these cases, these are like particular public hearings where you have like 6 or 7 individuals from civil society and none other, which is like the token public hearing that they give to civil society. So many of those are in these meetings and not in the meetings where more wide discussions and more people are present to hear the arguments that are being made. And this was done through a basic search in the website of the Committee of Energy in the House of Representatives, so it was not that much trouble, meaning that that's information that is reasonably available. Next slide, please. Looking at the Senate, we did have to make a freedom of information request to get access to the people who are able to get into the business, into the building. This is not directly related to energy or climate action, but it should be said, and it's very clear, the level of underrepresentation of civil society who have facilitated access to this crucial building. I used to work at the Senate. It's not easy to get in. So when you do actually have a credential, it makes things a lot easier. You have access to the decision makers. And as you can see, civil society is the minority here, with only 2 people have access as civil society representatives to the Brazilian Senate. And it should be said, and I think this is an example of sometimes how difficult it is to get access to these types of information, that we also made a freedom of information request to the House of Representatives, which has not been replied yet after the deadline has been passed. So sometimes it's very difficult to get access to the information, but even when you do get access to partial information, it is possible to make this argument and demonstrate how big corporate interests takes over decision-making processes at the highest level. And just going to the last one, this is the schedule of the Minister for the Economy, Minister for Energy, for the past 1.5 years. We looked into his schedule and who he has met in this time, and it's not surprising to see that civil society has only been present, considering the whole number of participants, over 4,000 participants in his meetings, only 2% were civil society representatives. And within these 2%, we also considered unions, which were there, of course, representing the interests of their affiliates, but not necessarily climate-related interests. And specifically regarding this particular research and this particular data point that we found, it should be said that this is also a demonstration of how difficult it is to get data, because originally the schedule of public officials was supposed to be available since 2013. Due to a conflict of interest law that was passed at the time. It took almost 10 years for that to be effectively regulated, for a platform to be installed, for the public officials to begin filling the forms so we have access to this information. And even so, I'm not under the impression that all meetings have been registered. I know that a lot have not. Maybe not that much for the minister, but for his top advisors mostly. There are a lot of schedules which are still blank when you access the platform. So it's very difficult still to get information, but even when we get like small pieces of information, we have been able to get enough to tell the story of how corporate interests control, and there's no effective balance between the interests that are represented in the decision-making processes which impact climate.
Thank you for this very practical example of national level research that you've been doing. And I think that's a perfect transition towards looking into opportunities and challenges of data-driven policy advocacy. And I would like to turn to Edward next to ask which kind of opportunities and challenges have you been facing in data-driven advocacy?
Sure. Well, I mean, the main challenge is the extreme differences in resources available to the different interest groups looking to advocate on climate, with the fossil fuel value chain, for example, able to leverage resources in the billions for their work very easily. It's not a problem for them. It's actually only a small percentage of their profits and revenue. It's a very, very good investment because it holds back climate regulation, which would otherwise stop them from selling their main products. And they will continue to do this. So it does sometimes seem very much like a David and Goliath challenge. I'd like to give maybe some positive examples, though, of when you have the data and the analysis on this, what can happen, especially if there's collaboration between different types of stakeholder. So to give a very specific example first, I've got two examples, but late on in 2022, we released a report using our data looking at the US trucking lobby. And we showed how that group, which represents many large automotive manufacturers, including the subsidiaries of many European companies, had been opposing clean vehicle rules in many states around the US. So we released this report showing the negative impacts of that lobbying and how it was contrary to the climate science and and science-based policy advice. This report got taken up by some NGOs and campaign groups working particularly in California. And later we found out that the regulator, CARB, California Air Resources Board, had come across it as well. So fast forward a little bit, in July 2023, we heard that CARB had actually struck an agreement with the trucking lobby. And although they'd made some concessions on some of the emissions rules, the trucking lobby had itself agreed to support and get behind the main bit of the policy, which was a zero emissions vehicle sales mandate. And importantly, they also agreed that they would stop or desist from challenging CARB's authority to regulate this rule, and would also stop opposing similar rules in other US states. So it was like a real win both for the climate policy that was on the table in California and also future climate policy that was being proposed in other US states. So that was a nice combination between the media and local NGO groups and the regulator itself, using data to sort of push back on anti-climate lobbying. Sorry, I can stop.
Perhaps one very quickly.
Back to it. The other stakeholder group I wanted to highlight were the role of investors. So one of the main users of our data and research and rankings has been asset owners like pension groups and their asset managers, who have been putting pressure on companies to get them to vastly improve their governance and reporting around their climate lobbying. And we've seen over 100 very large companies with high emissions produce far better reporting on this, including taking actions on addressing their industry associations, sometimes leaving or sometimes working to reform those. So investors are another important stakeholder group here.
And perhaps let's turn to another very practical example. So Patricia, at Greenpeace, you've been working with national oil companies and their role in corporate lobbying. What do you think, what needs to change to effectively regulate this type of influence at the global level?
Well, it's working? Yeah. Thank you. So this is an area that's quite complex and where there isn't a lot of research. Given the very close relationship between national oil companies and their governments. So NOCs, as we refer to them, are poorly understood due to weak and uneven reporting, sparse research, and an absence of publicly available comparative data. The information on production and revenue is available for most national oil companies, but less than half of those who reported on capital expenditure or employment. And of the national oil companies that have reported, those in the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa disclose the least. They often spend or invest resources they collect without transferring them to the national budget. And so there's no public scrutiny. So that's kind of the big picture. And then when it comes to specific challenges, it's difficult to get international pressure on national oil corporations, and I can imagine that my colleague from Brazil can speak to that specifically, because communication has to come from within the country. It has to be done locally. It's very political work, because in effect, you're challenging the government, and the government can always say they use the revenues to build, they're using it for health or for education, and by attacking the companies, you're challenging the government. They employ lots of companies. Politicians can argue they need the pipelines and oil revenue to build wind power. I mean, these are actual conversations that we've had. By the same token, there are key opportunities that I think we should be exploring, and that's to connect national oil corporations with corruption, with funding wars, conflicts, violence, shifting companies to renewable energy. This is what we keep telling Shell. It's like, you want to do something useful, get into the renewable energy business, which may be more feasible than closing them out. Privatization does offer a chance to change the narrative. And looking at financial subsidies, building networks of indigenous communities that are impacted to document national oil company crimes is another approach. What happened at the European level with the European Quality Directive looking at dirty fuel is an example, stopping dirty fuel. And there may be some possibilities within OPEC to play on rivalry. So it's not all bleak. So let me just stop there.
Thank you, Patricia. Turning to Raphael again, you've mentioned some of the challenges that you're facing. What do you think at the EU level in terms of loopholes preventing conflicts of interest to be effectively regulated? What would you advise your asks?
Well, I mean, it's no secret, unfortunately, that Brussels has been quite scandal-prone in recent years. We had perhaps one of the biggest and largest corruption scandal in the history of the EU, and at the heart of the scandal is the fact that all the safeguards that are supposed to be in place against undue influence were not there at the time, and unfortunately, they're still not there today. And particularly, if we recall back a bit at the graph that I showed you, a lot of our data is really focused on the European Commission, and there's a reason for that is because the European Commission makes this register and the registration mandatory, which means that all the information can be connected with the lobby meetings, but this is not the case inside the European Parliament. So in the European Parliament, until very recently, we only had the tip of the iceberg, and it is still today possible, despite the scandals that happened, to still meet with members of the European Parliament without being transparent about who you are, what interests you represent, what resources you spend. And so this is, let's say, loophole number one when it comes to the transparency element. But then there's also an integrity element in this discussion, because members of the European Parliament, they have a code of conduct, and that code of conduct, let's say, is pardon the expression, but riddled with loopholes to the point of having sort of like a grated cheese kind of image. And one of which is that they're allowed to engage in side activities. They have very weak provisions against the revolving door, but they also have an extremely weak sanctioning system to the point of it being practically non-existent. And just to cite a couple of numbers to understand the scale of the problem, when we looked at the number of sanctions for breaches to the code of conduct in the previous mandate, there were 0 sanctions taken over the entire course of the mandate, despite 24 documented cases that was reported by an advisory committee on ethics that is composed by MEPs. In this mandate, I want you to guess the number. 0. Again, there were 2 sanctions taken for cases of harassment, but there was 0 sanctions taken for breaches to the code of conduct for breaching integrity rules. And that gives you the scale of the problem, because inside the European Parliament, the enforcement of the code of conduct only rests on the goodwill of the President of the European Parliament, which has an incentive of trying to protect the institution instead of trying to enforce integrity. And despite the Qatargate scandal, and despite other numerous scandals, and we also have heard about undue influence from perhaps other foreign entities more recently, the MEPs have decided that they would not close these loopholes. So we had very timid advances, but now we have our work cut out. And I would say that it is really important to make MEPs realize that the risk of not closing these loopholes means that we put the Green Deal at risk itself. So that would be the answer.
Thank you, Raphael. So let's try to be optimistic. Try to look ahead in terms of what technological solutions could help. And I would like to turn to Emily again. You've talked about AI, and we see that there's an increasing amount of data available. So in your opinion, what do you think, what would be the next technological loop?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of exciting stuff going on right now in data world, so to speak. I mean, I think, some of the big things that I've seen in terms of ability to track things, especially at the international level, have to do with this increase in ability to use these large language models to understand policy documents and things. So for instance, there's I think they call themselves a nonprofit startup called Climate Policy Radar that has digitized and used a large language model to understand most of, all of the nationally determined contribution submissions, the UNFCCC, plus most kind of international climate documents, which is something that's just not been done before. And they've been encouraging people to use that as a tool to of accountability, right? To kind of understand if countries are sort of committing to the sorts of things that they could be committing to. We've also kind of been looking into using that data. So they're lovely people, and the data is quite freely available. We've been looking into using it potentially to, for instance, look at whether countries include business as part of their civil society. So when they talk about civil society in their NDCs, are they including business as part of that? Are they including business interests? So I think it sort of unlocks a lot of really interesting potential there. So yeah, I think there is a lot of potential, and there's just so much kind of data that's out there. I think one of the challenges that comes along with this as well, though, is that people who don't necessarily want to be held accountable are getting quite cautious about the kind of data that they release in this context. So we found, data that should be publicly available from governments and things, be put into formats that are very difficult to read, and things like this. And then, of course, issues where we have a campaign that works on digital threats. So it's kind of interested in understanding how climate misinformation is used by companies. And it used to be that you could get access to, Twitter had a way to access tweets in a systematic kind of way, and now they've made that borderline impossible, as have most kind of social media outlets. So it makes it very difficult to kind of to do that. So yeah, I think there's a lot of real opportunities in that kind of AI machine. AI is it's just like a huge field, but particularly within kind of machine learning, but also some real challenges that comes along with that as well.
Thank you, Emily. And I think it's fascinating to hear that civil society is becoming ever more capable using data-driven approaches for policy advocacy. Guillaume, at the national level in Brazil, I'd like to hear from you. Where do you see opportunities? Which approaches could work in a context with poor public integrity standards and limited information available?
Yeah, I think one of the main challenges that we face is first, at a first level, the existence of an obligation to produce these types of data. So having effective legal frameworks where not only public officials, which were the focus of my presentation and the research here, but also private companies and private individuals are having to present those information in some way, register them so that they become available to other organizations and data scientists who will be able to then look into those informations and try to get this type of analysis that my colleagues here produce so well. I think most countries still don't have that type of regulation and legislation. So it is important for us to connect the environmental and climate community and the anti-corruption community in defense of these types of legal frameworks. I think sometimes the communities still don't see the value in these types of legal frameworks. For example, in Brazil, we recently had a lot of discussion around lobbying regulation, but there was sort of a stigma on lobbying regulation, even from some environmental NGOs, that these would provide and lead to increased barriers for them to access the decision makers. So in some way, in certain circumstances, that might be the case because in some countries, lobbying regulation has been used as a barrier for access to public officials and the decision-making process. But I think we still need to make sure that the possibilities and the access to this type of information is clear so that we can understand and join forces in defense of these types of regulations and legal frameworks. At a second level, these frameworks have to be effectively implemented, and it is our job as civil society to monitor that implementation. So looking into once the legal framework, once the laws, the policies are in place, are they being effectively implemented? What is the process or the trainings, or is there an effective platform for the information to be provided? Is the private sector being held accountable when it says that it should provide these types of information? The information, once existent, should be made available in the data sets and the formats that are useful for organizations, researchers who want to work on them and produce more detailed analysis. And lastly, I think we still need to build more capacity, and I think this type of panel is important for that, within civil society and within academia, into how to produce these data analysis and this type of information in a way that is friendly and also communicable to a wider audience. I'm always impressed, and I use a lot of the work from Influence Map because I think it is very well produced and it demonstrates the impact and the connections that can be made. But I think more organizations need to reach that level to also be able to conduct this type of work at a national level, and for us to build connections with the organizations at a global level who are producing this type of knowledge, for us to be able to demonstrate some of the impacts that Patricia mentioned on specific policies, on specific issues, events that happen, so we can demonstrate the causality between the corporate interests taking over the decision-making process and the impact that it has on everyone's daily lives.
It's great to see that you're inspired by other organizations and the data that they are providing and they're bringing together and how they work. Raphael, very quickly, perhaps, what do you think in terms of public good data-driven platforms? Can they inspire the wider public to hold corporations and governments to account?
Well, I certainly hope so, and I actually have the first-hand witness of this working. So when we started all the way back in 2016 with Integrity Watch, the first platform, we had a tremendous amount of success in the press. So it was very successful in raising awareness in the media on all the issues that we were pushing for. But we also felt a little bit lonely because there were no other organizations engaging with the data and actually doing some similar work, perhaps in their own field. And if we fast forward to today, I actually counted around 15 organizations active in Brussels that are using this data for their own purposes, and civil society organizations, and organizing themselves in the same manner of data-driven advocacy to push forward their own recommendations. And this is really heartening because it means that it's working. It took a bit of time because obviously the barrier of entry sometimes a lot of organizations are a bit scared of engaging the data because, as Guillermo rightfully said, not everybody is an Excel wizard. But you know, the key to its success as well is that what we do is that we keep it very simple. For a very specific reason is because when you sit down in front of a European Member of Parliament, you do not have the time to really explain the ins and outs of how you get to your data analysis. You need a flashing number that they really get so that your recommendations carries that weight. And so the success that we have is really based on this light touch analysis that journalists can pick up quickly. And then we have the academia that can go a lot further. And this is also where I say it's a public good platform, because I've also counted perhaps more than 50 academic articles that have been published based on Integrity Watch data alone. And it also shows that we are reaching out far further than just the community in Brussels. There are academics all around Europe that are engaged with this data. Media is engaged, and now different types of civil society organizations are also engaged. And the idea, obviously, for us in Brussels now is to try to pull all of this together to even maximize our effect in trying to shore up these integrity systems inside the European Parliament and the European Commission.
Thank you. And perhaps turning back to Greenpeace, Patricia, what do you think? How can there be better, meaningful inclusion of people to hold big polluters to account in terms of climate action?
This is where we are engaging. We have a global project on climate justice and liability, which is part of movement lawyering. And so the movement is involved with citizens. I'm thinking now of a specific example in the Philippines where we supported some work that was done for the Commission on Human Rights of the Philippines. And not only did that come out with a recommendation to close some of the loopholes on integrity that we haven't had a chance to get to, but it also led us to start using citizens' data. And so not only in the Philippines, but in South Korea, we've set up a program that's basically designed to combat what we refer to as greenwashing. And so it's set up so that citizens, I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head now, but there is a pool of citizens who review the corporate activities against certain criteria. And so citizens are engaged in this. So I think that's one of the ways we need to mobilize citizens to be part of the solution, because they're the ones who are going to be impacted by this.
Thank you. So I'm aware of the fact that we have very experienced, knowledgeable people sitting around in the audience. I'd also like to hear from you. We have something like 10 minutes left for Q&A, but also for you to share your experience with data-driven approaches to advocacy. Tell us about your challenges and also any advice, any good practices and lessons learned that you would like to share with your colleagues. I see Janine. Please.
Hi, I've used some of your work myself. My name is Daiva Rebečkaitė. I'm an investigative journalist. I think maybe one area where I have a lot of interest lately is who is buying social media influence. So that's maybe one area that could be merged to all the research that is happening. But my question to the panelists today is, have you looked at the farmers' protests that spanned Europe and probably went beyond, and who is trying to extend their influence operations, mobilizing people with understandable grievances in that way, but very clearly creating coordinated action, kind of copycat protests across Europe. And have you used any of your tools to see who is behind this kind of movement that saw a lot of environmental policy achievements challenged or actually cancelled out? Thank you.
Thank you, and perhaps we'll give opportunity to a second person to ask any questions, any contributions before handing back to Robin.
Hi, I'm Robin Hodis with the B team. We work with business on a lot of these agendas, and I'm a strong believer in evidence-based advocacy, which is now, I guess, data-driven advocacy too. And I wanted to ask how you're starting with advocacy as the goal, because I think the points that you made from Greenpeace in particular about what you want to change has to determine the kinds of evidence you're working on. I mean, from civil society, sometimes we produce so much data and it doesn't help. So how do we get to the right data? And there I'd ask Ed to come in, because it feels like there's a big push now on the numbers game here, how many lobbyists there are and what the imbalances are, civil society and business. But what about what's in the black box of what business is pushing for? How do we get to what the positions are from this sort of trade association and common interest areas where we know that sometimes they're really working at lowest common denominator rather than where some of the more ambitious businesses are on your graph? So how do we unpack what's happening inside those numbers, and also can we bring qualitative back to quantitative and really have a powerful argument for the change we need? Thanks.
Thank you, and perhaps I'll turn to Ed first and then to Patricia second.
Great, yeah, thanks for the questions. I'll try to speak to all of them quickly. So yeah, just the note about social media advertising, it's super important. It's a really powerful tool that companies can use to very specifically target messages at different demographics and regions. We see it being used a lot. Some social media companies provide some data on where those advertisers end up. It's fascinating, and you really can see very specifically sort of reverse engineer the sort of tactics that companies are using to sort of fire off specific messages at different groups, especially in the lead up to big political moments like elections. Yes, we have done some adjacent research relevant to the farming protests, although we didn't look at the protests themselves. We have looked at how large agricultural lobby groups in the EU have engaged on a number of Green Deal specific policy streams and had a big impact there. I think what's interesting is lots of the arguments and negativity now being associated with regular farmers in Europe were arguments that actually had been made and communicated by these big industrial lobby groups for many years before the last year, and it should suggest that that's really where a lot of this blaming of climate policy and specifically is coming from. And finally, on getting to the right data, yeah, I mean, our assessment process is largely qualitative. So we are looking specifically at the positions companies are putting forward. Getting to that data isn't that easy. We have to spend the best data is always behind a few layers, often freedom of information requests or trying to find the right disclosures from governments in their consultations with companies. It's very detailed sometimes. It requires very trained analysts to be able to assess it and compare it against science-based policy. So it takes a lot of work. I think the key is in summarizing that in a nice, clear way to ensure that many other stakeholders can engage with it and use it in their own work.
Yeah, Patricia?
Actually, on the farmers' protest, I think that's an excellent question. I don't have the answer on that, but maybe Raphael, since you're in Brussels, you may have a sense of what's going on. Of course, there are also farmers' protests going on in India at the same time. So sometimes these agendas are connected, as we see with let's just say, authoritarian right-wing governments who tend to take the long view and keep their playbooks simple, unlike those of us on the progressive left who complicate things. And so when it comes to the farmers' protest, whoever's behind it it should not have happened because we should have been allied with the farmers around the Green New Deal. There's no question in my mind on that. So we were played off of each other. But again, Raphael, you may have some insights. I deal with global issues more. I think the question from the lady from the B team, yeah, good question. I'm going to turn it around and share, if it's okay with our moderator, Suzanne. I'm going to add to your question, because I don't think we do a lot of data gathering, like Global Witness, everybody gathers data. What worries me in a world that's increasingly polarized, where there's misinformation and disinformation, who's going to be scandalized by the data? We come up with this and we're still operating, at least we in Greenpeace, we use this model, IDEAL, where you identify, document, expose, I forget what the A is, and lobby, and it's our model. But we haven't kept up with the evolution of what's happening. So we're still thinking we're going to scandalize people and then they're going to take action. And I just wonder if we may not need to rethink that given where we are today. And I would hope, the journalists might have a better idea of that. So it's not an answer to your question.
Thank you. Raphael, any 2 cents, 1 sentence on the farmer process?
Yeah, just very quickly, we didn't have a chance to really look at the linkages between lobby organizations in Brussels and the farmers' protest, but it is very clear, just as Edward said, that some of the messaging aligned quite neatly with what the largest lobby organizations on farming in Brussels has been saying, Copacocheca, which is also one of the most well-resourced lobby organizations in Brussels and most connected lobby organizations in Brussels. And clearly, a lot of the policies of the Green Deal were going against some of the things that they were advocating for. And now, whether there was a direct connection or maybe they just served on a wave of perhaps perceived discontent and sort of lit the fire and just amplified it to a way that was, the success was beyond anything that I would have expected. Just to situate yourself, we had 5,000 tractors in the street blocking everything, and that is a very powerful image. What I find a bit more dangerous here is that actually a lot of politicians surfed on this wave to then go a step further than what the farmers are demanding and really saying, well, how about we just challenge other things from the Green Deal, not just related to farming, but now we're also challenging perhaps the end of the phasing out of fossil fuel itself. And there are some politicians now that are going to do that in the European Parliament. So I agree with Patricia that we find ourselves in a bit of a polarized society where some politicians are trying to profit from that to increase their share of power and to stay in power. And how do we try to counter that? Because we have very well-resourced organizations. We now have a fraying coalition around the Green Deal. And I think the only solution, and not to be completely negative, is for us to really coordinate as much as possible through the data, our advocacy to save the Green Deal itself.
Raf, and with that, I think time is unfortunately already coming to an end. So I would like to ask each of the panelists for a concluding remark, maybe 1 or 2 sentences, and perhaps starting with Edward, and we just move along.
Yeah, so it's trying to end on something more positive. I think there are lots of ways which data now can maybe encourage new strategies and new ways of working together on sort of data-inspired, empowered advocacy. We're working on ways to sort of present our data differently. So instead of looking at companies, we're also looking how key policies are being impacted on a sort of a real-time basis, week to week, and finding groups of maybe it's the civil society groups or positive business groups or other groups that might be able to use that data to plan their strategic and positive interventions to push back on some of the negative lobbying. So I think that's exciting and maybe an avenue of activity that could be open to a much wider group of stakeholders as well.
Thank you. Emily, would you like to go next?
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, this has been such an interesting and inspiring panel. I think sort of just one thought. I mean, again, so much interesting work kind of being used to bring data to life and to kind of use it to demonstrate the role of corporate inference in corporate lobbying, I'm going to maybe steal Patricia's point, because I thought the point you made about sort of scandalized, who gets scandalized and what are we doing, so we can bring these things to people's attention, right? We can use these this data to sort of demonstrate all of these problems in a lot of detail and a lot of clarity, perhaps more than we could have before. But yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. Like, what is the next steps? What do we kind of do with that? How do we take that forward? I think is the big challenge for, I think, for me personally, for I think a lot of us in this movement. So I'll be, kind of interested to continue that discussion.
Patricia?
Thanks, Suzanne. So I'm a political person, so I think in terms of power and counterpower. And I also do a lot of comms, so I think of villains and good guys. So it seems to me, and this keys off of what Raphael just said, I think we need to come together. We need to work more in allyship. That's really why I'm here this week, is to meet people and figure out who else we should be connecting with. So I think, again, as Edward said, you don't want to be negative. So I think it's going to be tougher. I think we need to be realistic. The fossil fuel industry is on the back foot. That's why they're looking in the plastics negotiations, as I said, with their Plan B. They have to pay. These people knew what they were doing, and they need to pay. And that's why we are campaigning on stop drilling, start paying. So make polluter pays. That's got to be one thing. But I think we need to start thinking of building counterpower and playing to our strengths. So let me stop there.
I'm gonna end up, I think, on a more negative and boring note, because I think on one hand, the evolution and the progress on anti-corruption legislation, policies, legal frameworks, etc., has not been at the pace it needs to be to keep up with the threat of the climate crisis. So if we keep at the same pace, we won't be able to get there, and corruption, conflict of interest, corporate interests will continue to interfere and serve as obstacles to the improvement of these energy, climate-related policies. And at the same time, we've been seeing, and that's why it's been difficult to be on a more positive note coming from Brazil, we've been seeing numerous setbacks in these types of anti-corruption policies. So not only do we have to be more urgent in terms of increasing the pace of these improvements and this evolution, but we also need to be incredibly and even more vigilant to the threat of setbacks, because as Raphael mentioned, as this information becomes more available and we start to use them, it becomes more likely that they'll stop registering information. The companies will stop publishing information about what they're lobbying for. So I think it is an incredible challenge.
Too much transparency kills transparency. Who knows? So I'll keep it very short, but and maybe to end then on a more positive note. Obviously, for us in Brussels, one of the key aim and one of the key ways to influence policies in Brussels is to Europeanize issues and to maximize, the connections with our chapters so that they also raise awareness on these issues nationally. And I think it's really the cross-border exchange of best practices, where initially, for example, having a lobby register sounded like science fiction in certain countries is no longer the case. And the more countries come on board with trying to fight undue influence and have political integrity system in place, the more they will understand how valuable it is for their policy making, and the more hopefully we can convince not only the other civil society organizations, but also governments across the EU that action needs to be taken everywhere, and specifically in Brussels. So that's perhaps a way forward, and it's something that has been slightly started in the last year, and I really hope that we're going to be doing that in the coming years as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think that's a positive outlook after all. So thank you for a fantastic panel, a great audience, fantastic questions, contributions. I think it's been interesting to see what kind of work's already being done. Very fascinating in terms of how data-driven approaches can strengthen policy advocacy for climate actions. I think we discussed challenges, very practical challenges at different levels, global, EU, but also national level. And we've discussed how, looking ahead, we have the next technological developments, frontiers. So we need to keep working on these issues also to catch up, to be ahead of the bad guys, to link up to Patricia's point on the villains and the good guys on the other hand. So yeah, please feel free to discuss, stay here in the room if you like, discuss with the panelists, discuss amongst you, and thanks for coming, thanks for joining us, and it's been great to have you around. Thank you.